Hello my friends, and welcome to the channel for another Escape From Tarkov video. This one is something that I've been sort of tossing around in my head for a long while, and it might seem kind of ironic for me of all people to say this, considering I built an entire channel largely based on showcasing weapon building in Tarkov. But to be honest, the weapon building in Tarkov has been stale for a long time, to the point where I barely even find it fun to interact with the system anymore. There's a lot of factors at play that go into this. There's obvious things like certain weapons having access to ammo that's just better than everything else. But there's also much more subtle things, like hidden stats on certain weapons, specific attachments which just don't work properly, or awkwardly placed unlocks and wacky pricing which makes some items just not worth using over others. It's a real shame too, because there's so much to use and explore in this game. But if you look around, you're generally going to see people not only using the same weapons, but the same parts down to the smallest detail, simply because it doesn't make sense to use anything else. In this video, I'm going to cover a whole list of things that I think led us to the spot that we're in now, playing a game with hundreds of attachments where only about 20 of them are actually worth using. Now, the first and most obvious thing that brings Tarkov's modding system to a halt is simply the way that stats are applied to attachments. There isn't many factors that actually affect the performance of a build in Tarkov, and it's basically a numbers game at the end of the day. You have two stats that realistically affect your weapon performance: ergonomics and recoil. For the most part, nobody cares about ergonomics, so then we really only have one stat: recoil. Recoil reduction is applied to attachments as a simple percentage reduction. So regardless of what weapon you're building, a higher percentage means a better build, which means the best in-slot attachments are just the ones with the highest numbers. There is no differentiation between horizontal and vertical recoil stats on attachments. There's no unique features or benefits of lightweight versus heavy attachments. There's no inherent benefit to running anything except the part that has the highest numbers on it. This single factor essentially renders a large majority of parts useless to anyone trying to be competitive, because big number equals good and small number equals bad. I think the best examples of this are foregrips and stock attachments, which have basically always come down to a choice between 2 or 3 best options for any build that can use them, and everything else is basically pointless. There are so many cool foregrips and stocks in Tarkov, but in gameplay terms, there's no reason to use anything except for the ones with either the best recoil, the best ergonomics, or the best combination of the two for the lowest price. This is a damn shame, considering there's well over 20 options for both foregrips and stocks, but there's no reason to use any of them except the best 3 or 4. And the rest kind of just take up space on the trader screen. On top of this, there's almost no consistency in the pricing and unlock paths for attachments in Tarkov, which means there's a whole ton of parts in the game that either A, are better than everything else and cheaper, or B, worse than the meta parts and more expensive, meaning they are doubly useless because you're creating a worse build and paying extra money for the privilege of doing so. Here are my 2 favorite examples of this. First is the KAC QD 762 suppressor and the muzzle brake kit, which is without a contest the best 762 suppressor combo in Tarkov. This unlocks at Peacekeeper level 3 and sells for $480. The SDN 6 suppressor, which is worse statistically, unlocks at level 4 Peacekeeper and sells for $650. Here's another one. The 556 Saker suppressor, which is one of the 2 best 556 suppressors, and is sold by Peacekeeper level 4 for $590. The KAC QD 556 suppressor, which is considerably worse because its muzzle adapter isn't nearly as good, is also sold by Peacekeeper level 4 for $675. These are just 2 examples, but this is everywhere in Tarkov. You find attachments, armor, helmets, and ammo all over the traders, which are both worse statistically and more expensive than other options you have, which renders them pointless to nearly any player who remotely cares about their effectiveness and overall economy. On the topic of suppressors, here's another thing that's rubbed me the wrong way for too long now. Why are suppressors just automatically better than compensators? And why does this divide just keep getting worse with every update, when there's a new suppressor with 1% better recoil that just keeps the power creep going. For a long time in Tarkov, you made a choice when building your gun. Go loud and have good recoil, or go suppressed and have the stealth advantage with worse recoil on your build. That's not a choice anymore. You either go suppressed and have the best stats, or you go loud and have a bad build. What a thrilling gameplay choice. There's also the fact that on basically every build except the M4, you're almost forced into using the longest available barrel if you want to have reasonable recoil. This has been a problem since interchangeable barrels were added to the game, and the only weapon that has really received any buffs to short barrels is the M4, which is kind of fine by me because it's my favorite gun. When's the last time you saw someone run a 416 without the longest barrel, or an SA58 without the longest barrel? That's right, you haven't. Because the second that poor soul pulled the trigger, the recoil pattern of the short barrels made them take flight and blast off like a discount Team Rocket. All of these factors chip away at the viable parts that you can use for a competitive build. But what about the biggest single factor of them all? Ammo choice. Well, here's another factor which basically just serves to reinforce a 2 to 3 gun meta every single wipe. Because your ammo dictates your damage and armor penetration in Tarkov, we often end up dealing with a caliber meta as much as a gun meta, and this swings both ways for good and for bad. On one hand, it means that any gun that shoots a good bullet with good stats can be a good gun. On the other hand, it means that any gun that shoots a bad bullet with bad stats, or one that's hard to acquire, basically doesn't have a chance. The stats of the build don't matter when the ammo that the build uses can't effectively kill a player kitted out in relevant armor at a certain distance. The way ammo and damage works in Tarkov means that things like the 7.62 BP meta are inescapable, and entire calibers like 9mm just have zero relevance, because not only does it not perform well against armor, but you can't even buy enough of the ammo to make a single loadout for one raid. This also directly causes things like bolt-action rifles to be irrelevant unless you're using them for a quest or as a personal challenge, because there's no way for a single weapon in a category to be buffed in terms of damage or pen without indirectly buffing every single other weapon in that caliber. This often means that an entire caliber of weapons end up sucking, simply because one weapon in that caliber is a little bit too good. Thank you, 9mm Vector. Now, after all of this talk of how stats on attachments leads to incredibly limited modding for most builds, you would maybe think that optics might be that one part on your build that comes down to personal preference, since after all, they generally don't have any stats on them besides maybe a small ergonomics penalty. But you'd be wrong. Sights might not have stats tied to them, but they also certainly don't behave consistently. Some sights wobble more than others while you're moving. Some sights artificially inflate your recoil. Some sights even slow down your aiming sensitivity when you use them, which is a big red flag. Just take a look at this recoil demo from 3 different red dot sights on the exact same build, and tell me that the delta point isn't just straight up more effective than either of the other two. So this also leads to more of the same. Everyone uses the same 3 or 4 scopes because the rest either do not work properly or they make your build feel worse. On the topic of aiming, we also have the aiming speed dilemma. Now, according to the weapon modding logic of Tarkov, ergonomics is the stat that should dictate how fast you can aim your weapon. In theory, that's kind of a good thing. You can pick between building a quick and snappy gun or one that shoots straight with good recoil stats. Here's the thing though. There's a way to instantly aim down your sights after sprinting, bypassing all ergonomics penalties. Here's a comparison of a SCAR with 6 ergonomics and an MDR with 69 ergonomics. You'll notice that after sprinting, both guns come up at the same speed. So essentially, ergonomics is a worthless stat once you realize you can just come out of sprint with a recoil build and hit your shots better. Now, to me, the final nail in the coffin is about the developers' reaction to this whole fiasco, on both a small scale for individual issues and more broadly as a whole. Because of the slow progress of changes when it comes to weapons, attachments, and ammo, were often stuck dealing with the same issues for months or years at a time. The 7.62 BP and M62 meta dictated the entire game for over a year before anything was even done about it. Sniper scopes that were in the game since it launched into closed alpha are still not properly working and are borderline useless. The LCAN scope has had a slot to add a red dot sight on top of it since it was added 4 years ago, and we still cannot attach a red dot sight onto it. As of making this video, there has been a glitched M4 build with 19 recoil that has been in the game for 4 months without even being mentioned on a list of upcoming fixes. It took nearly 2 years of almost constant complaining from the community before the developers adjusted the recoil system after they initially broke it. 9mm hasn't been a relevant caliber for over a year, with no changes in sight to attempt and make it competitive again for the average player. So on top of all the issues that are basically hard-baked right into the formula when it comes to building guns, we also have to wait months or years, or even sometimes just never, for anything to be done about even basic things like scopes not working properly. One common response to this, especially from the developers, is to say that weapon balance is a low priority, that major features and content like maps are more important, and that it will all be ironed out eventually upon release. I do see the logic behind this, but unfortunately it's kind of missing the reality that weapon balance is one of those major things that affect every player's experience in every single raid all of the time. I'm sure the intentions are good, but when the weapon balance and modding system is so out of whack that players feel forced to use certain setups to even remotely be competitive against other players, and every raid ends up being people using the same builds and playing in the same way, it just gets stale. At the end of the day, I don't know how much any of this bothers the average player. I'm sure some people just don't care, and I know for a fact that most people will just look up what the current meta build is and run that all wipe, because it's easy and you can avoid all the frustration of trying things out yourself and realizing that you wasted your money. But for people who have put in the time to sink their teeth into the modding system in depth, or for people whose whole enjoyment of Tarkov comes from building weapons, there isn't many conclusions to come to besides this whole thing needs work. From a visual standpoint, Tarkov has the best weapons in FPS gaming, period. There's no competitor, there's no other game that has this much stuff and this many options for making cool guns your own way. From a functional standpoint for players in the game though, this modding system is full of new player traps, inconsistencies, power creep over time, and the illusion of choice. I don't know what the perfect solution is, I just know that in my dream version of Tarkov, there is no one single best attachment in any category on any gun. All scopes work like you expect them to, and the pricing of attachments should reflect how good or bad they are intended to be, not just seem random. That's it. That's the video. I hope you found this enlightening at the very least, and maybe this will give you something to think about, or give some more people a reason to say these things to BSG so they actually have to listen. Thanks for watching. I have links to my Twitch stream and Discord server down below, and until next time, stay safe in Tarkov City.